Good afternoon, everybody. I think it's time to get started. Our dean, Arun, is coming in a few minutes, but we should get going today. So my name is Rodolfo Dirzo, and I'm a professor in environmental science in the departments of biology and earth system science as well. Within the Stanford Doerr School for Sustainability, I serve as Associate Dean for Integrative Initiatives on Environmental Justice. Thank you so much to you all for being here today. It is so encouraging and exciting and inspirational to see so many students, faculty, staff, and members of the broad community within and outside Stanford. Thank you for joining us. So wonderful to see you all taking part in this exciting event regarding such a critical topic of environmental justice. Before I go any further, let me start by acknowledging and honoring the Mowek-Maohloneh people. I have put together this slide, which is not advancing somehow. Can anybody help? It advances in my computer, but it doesn't show in the screen. These things never happen, don't worry. So this is the first time this is going to. There you go. So I was saying, I put together this slide, taking some elements of the Mowek-Maohloneh people's website for you to see that they're welcoming us to visit with them in the website, and also because I wanted to share with you the link to the website in case you're interested in getting to know more about this amazing group of people. You can also check the recently launched Stanford Land Acknowledgement website, which includes the statement for the Mawek Maolone. What I would like to do is to share with you the statement that I use in my own lab as a way of recognizing and honoring the Mawek Maolone. And it reads, in recognition of the unceded ancestral lands of the Mawek Maolone tribe, where our academic institution sits, we offer our grateful appreciation for the opportunity to live and work and play here, and we celebrate the culture and perseverance of the Mawek Maolone and their strong identity. I'd like to take advantage of this slide to ask you to please join me in a silent reflection, just a few seconds, regarding the valuable contributions of all Native peoples. Thank you. And I want to say also thank you to our Dean, Arun, for presenting us this fantastic invitation. Join leading scholars for wide-ranging discussions around the frontiers of research, education, practice, and impact for environmental justice. So this is our job this afternoon. This event is truly special because we have 3 stellar EJ scholars who have generously taken time out of their busy schedules to share with us key complementary perspectives on environmental justice scholarship, and I will introduce them in a minute. But before I do that, let me also recognize the inspiring effort of a collective of people from the Stanford community who have created a tremendously active and passionate environmental justice working group. I want to make special emphasis on the outstanding work of my friends and colleagues, Dr. Sybil Diver and Dr. Emily Pott. Thank you so much. Because they have catalyzed this effort and consolidated a vibrant group of students, faculty, and staff committed to environmental justice. Thank you so much. However, despite this foundational effort, and although many of the members of the university at large, myself included, we are deeply committed to and passionate about education, environmental justice, many of us do not have a formal training in environmental justice per se. Clearly, becoming better informed, inspired, and involved in environmental justice work is a critical agenda in our aspirations for sustainability and for combating the social inequalities engendered by the socio-environmental issues of the Anthropocene. And here I'm referring obviously to climate change, but in addition to that, land use change, invasive species, pollution, and of course, the loss of biological diversity. For those reasons, we see guidance and inspiration of scholars like the 3 experts who have joined us today. Indeed, many scholars and students committed to environmental justice surely are eager to develop a better understanding of issues like the ones I would like to include briefly in this slide. First of all, from an institutional point of view, I have this gigantic question. I'm going to use a metaphor of seed germination and tree growth. How do we move from planting an environmental justice seed to become an exuberant, vigorous, reproductive environmental justice tree within our university? It's a huge task, and I'm so excited about it. Tremendous opportunity to aspire and dream about making this seed become a tree. On a more practical area, what are the conceptual bases and theoretical frameworks that enable scholarship in environmental justice? Here I'm thinking about things such as theory of change, research design, those kinds of things. What are the fundamental methodological approaches for environmental justice research and education? Here I touch on the incredibly challenging aspect of gaining trust when we work with indigenous communities, with local peoples, with rural peoples, participatory mapping, co-design of the research, and so on. What are the best practices to address trade-offs in decision-making? Almost every single thing that we do will imply a trade-off, but ensuring respect and dignity of all communities, especially those disproportionately impacted by environmental interventions? Can we identify the most promising answered environmental justice questions? Lessons from the past that can be taken advantage of for closing the bridge between knowledge and action regarding equitable environmental benefits. I strongly believe that many of my colleagues have similar aspirations of infusing environmental justice into their own research programs. So I am very excited not only to learn from today's roundtable discussion, but also I'm aspiring to continue interacting, collaborating with our three stellar speakers. We need your guidance and we need your help. So as you see, this is a fantastic opportunity to dream as to how to grow this tree of environmental justice in Stanford. It's a very challenging task, but it's so exciting. We have many opportunities to use our creativity and motivation to actually do it. And now let me tell you something about the metrics, the mechanics of the event. We're going to have 3 back-to-back presentations by each of the 3 scholars. I will then invite the 3 speakers to come to the front of the auditorium to engage in a conversation that I will try to facilitate, and then, or intermingle within that conversation, we will invite questions and comments from the attendees. Given the stature of the scholars we're fortunate to have today, this will not only be an important educational experience, but also a very intellectual divertimento. I promise, cross my heart. That's going to be. And now, let me introduce the first speaker for today's session, the Honorable Shalanda H. Baker. She is the Director of the Office of Economic Impact and Diversity at the U.S. Department of Energy and Secretarial Advisor on Equity. Previously, she served as the nation's first ever Deputy Director for Energy Justice. Before joining the Biden-Harris administration, she was a professor of law, public policy and urban affairs at Northeastern University. She received a BS from the United States Air Force Academy, a JD from Northeastern University, and an LLM from the University of Wisconsin. She has conducted research on the equity dimensions of the global transition away from fossil fuel energy to cleaner energy resources. I'm very proud to say the next thing. In 2016, she received the Fulbright Garcia Robles Research Fellowship to study climate change, energy policy, and indigenous rights in Mexico, particularly in the state of Oaxaca, which is one of the glorious sites of ecological diversity, biological diversity, cultural diversity, and a place that needs attention from the point of view of environmental justice. I'm so proud that Shalanda has taken this position in doing work in Oaxaca. She's also the co-founder and former co-director of the Initiative for Energy Justice, an organization committed to providing technical and policy support to communities on the frontiers of climate change. She is the author of numerous articles, books, chapters, and essays on renewable energy, energy justice, energy policy, and renewable energy development. She also has some very fantastic books that I really recommend for you to read. Revolutionary Power, An Activist's Guide to Energy Transition, published by Island Press, and so on. So without further ado, let me ask you to please join me in welcoming Shalanda Baker.
Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, we can do better. We can. Good afternoon. I first want to thank Rodolfo for his hospitality and that generous introduction. I also want to thank the Dean for putting together this speaker series and my interlocutors who've been wonderful companions throughout the day. I also just want to thank all of the faculty members and students with whom I've gotten the chance to meet, or with whom I've gotten the chance to connect. And also just thank you for coming out tonight. So I'm already 1 minute in, so I want to move quickly because we have 15 minutes. Today I want to introduce the dimensions of energy justice, which connects deeply to this long-standing discourse and activist practice of environmental justice. I want to offer a definition of energy justice, which again is informed by literature, but also very much rooted in activist practice. And then I want to talk about praxis. My work at the Department of Energy is to ensure that we have an equitable clean energy transition. So we have a lot of ground to cover in the next 15 minutes. So I really do believe that Justice 40, which is something I'll introduce, is a pathway to broader social transformation. And that is sort of the lead-in to today's talk. I'm going to take you back, first of all, to Mexico City, where, as Rodolfo said, I served as a Fulbright Garcia Robles Scholar and started my research. So I was in a room much like this one, at the top of the Sheraton Hotel in Paseo de la Reforma in downtown Mexico City. And I had been invited by the Mexican equivalent of the Secretary of Energy to sit in a room with other scholars, other members of government, and other, well, more broadly, members of the NGO community to talk about how Mexico would share in the benefits of its energy transition. So again, it was a room like this one, packed to the gills. And of course, as a researcher, I had my camera, I had my recorder, I was ready to go. And just as the meeting kicked off, there were panelists at the front, government officials, about 24 people marched into the room. They filed in, and they filled the spaces in the gaps. They were standing. And the woman to the far right here is a woman named Bettina Cruz. And she said, "We were not invited to this meeting, but we came anyway." And so that kicked off my Fulbright fellowship year. The folks who came into this room and actually ended up holding court for the next 2 days were from a place called Oaxaca. It's a place I've come to know and love over the last 12 years or so. Oaxaca is one of the windiest places in the world. This is a map that was put together by the National Renewable Energy Lab, which is a part of the Department of Energy. And this map indicates that the wind blows at a nearly constant state. It's also ground zero for Mexico's clean energy transition. Within the last decade or so, this particular place, which is home to 14 distinct indigenous groups that speak distinct indigenous languages, it's also home to farmers and fishermen and women who rely on the land to support a subsistence way of life. It's also one of the poorest places in Mexico, the second poorest state itself in Mexico. And again, it's where the wind blows at a nearly constant rate. They came to this place because over the last decade or so, they've experienced an exponential growth in wind energy development. And they've experienced that development without actually reaping any of the benefits of that development. In fact, these communities have been divided. Folks have died protesting large-scale wind energy development. They were often entering into contracts in Spanish when many of them did not speak or read Spanish and spoke indigenous languages. And in many ways, the process of development here in Oaxaca mirrored the process of extractive industries and extractive development. And so as a researcher, I got really interested in how we might actually avert the harms that we've seen in the typical development story. So we know that a system of development actually produced this outcome, where these folks have a lack of access to energy, and again are excluded more broadly from the development process. We now have around 2,200 megawatts of clean energy wind development in this particular small area. So this story of Oaxaca, of dispossession, of displacement, of death and destruction has informed my research for about a decade, and informs my work today. I wanted to start with this grounding because in many ways, if we do not change our models and approaches to development, we are doomed to replicate the injustices that we see in our current energy system. And so this provokes us to actually introduce new ways and new systems of development. And so I want to take us away from Mexico for a moment because someone in the room is thinking, well, that's the global south. Things are really different there, different history. But I want to bring us back to our own shores here in the United States. I was told that this was a panel on environmental justice. So we can't talk about environmental justice without talking about race and introducing it very explicitly into our discourse and into this discussion. In the US context, we know that we have had a system of state-sanctioned slavery, right, which persisted for centuries. We're far outside of that, but we still deal with its legacies, things like redlining, things like disinvestment in communities, school systems that are still imperfect and still very much segregated and don't allow for all kids to learn at equal rates. We also know that we have a history of dispossession and colonization in this country, just like the Mexico story. We know that indigenous wealth was extracted at extraordinary rates, and that Latinx, brown, and black bodies have been used to build the tremendous wealth in this country. So this is a broader system that I wanted to make sure we remembered. We also know that about 2 years ago, in the spring of 2020, we saw the very public murder of a black man on the streets of North Minneapolis. And I can imagine that many of you probably took to the streets, holding up signs, protesting, marching for a more just and equitable criminal justice system. But I would bet that no one in this room also took to the street calling for a more just and equitable energy system. But the energy system is wrapped up in that broader system of structural inequality and structural oppression that also created and produced the criminal justice system. So we know, based on research done by scholars for the last 30 years, that Black and Latinx communities are routinely exposed to more pollution than they produce. The bar graph on the left was produced by a National Academy study. This is, again, something that has been known and cited in the literature for decades, and also experienced and lived by communities. This is a slide that shows the impacts of pollution in the Bay Area. And we know that Latinx, API, Black communities face concentrations of industrial facilities, power plants, et cetera, and that those communities also, as a result, face higher rates of asthma, cancer, and heart disease. Scholars, again, have been doing this research. Our own Rachel Morello-Frosch, who's going to talk today, has been immersed in that literature for many years. This is the core of environmental injustice. This is about the siting of facilities and communities and the ways in which that creates adverse health impacts in those communities. This is state-sanctioned as well. So for these communities, they can't breathe. And I would like to say that the image on the left is photoshopped, but it's not. So that image comes from a place that's near and dear to my heart, Port Arthur, Texas, which is the birthplace and the epicenter of the modern fossil fuel industry. My dad grew up in that community. He grew up in the heart of oil and gas country. So Port Arthur is a low-income Latinx and Black community. People there rely on the industry to support their lives, while that industry also is killing them. There are higher rates of cancer and asthma in that place, and I stand on my dad's shoulders in the work that I do every day, but know that there are places like this that exist, where people were asked to shelter in place long before the pandemic required us all to go inside. So again, and none of this is accidental. This was due to the structure and design of our energy system. All of this is state-sanctioned, in fact, and worthy of inquiry. And so when I told you that, I bet no one in here was on the street marching for a more just and equitable energy system. We should have been, right? Because people are dying at exorbitant rates as a result of the structure and design of our system. I want to introduce other elements of energy justice and energy injustice into our discussion, and hopefully we can have a more robust discussion during the Q&A. Energy burden and energy insecurity are parts of the lexicon. Some of you may know those terms, but let me just level set. Energy burden is the overall amount of household income that goes to meet energy needs. The lower your income, because of the structure and design of our rates in this country, the more of that income, the more percentage, overall percentage, you're spending on energy. Energy insecurity is a direct outgrowth of high energy burden. Usually 6% is what we say is a reasonable amount of energy, overall percentage to spend on energy. But many households in this country are spending 10, 15, 20%, and sometimes 30% of their income to meet energy needs. We know, based on our own research at the Department of Energy, the Energy Information Administration, that about a third of American households experiences energy insecurity, which is lacking reliable access to energy resources and making the difficult choice of whether to heat your home or eat, or cool your home or eat. We also know that the problem is getting worse, and Census conducts routine surveys that illustrate that people are still struggling. They're reducing or forgoing basic necessities, they're keeping their home at unhealthy temperatures, which is leading to death. We also know that none of this is accidental. We designed our system in this way. So I told you that about a third of American households experiences energy insecurity. When we disaggregate that data, the picture gets pretty bleak for Black and brown people. Around 52.2% of Black households experiences energy insecurity, over half. Over half, and this is not the 1800s, this is 2020. When we look at Latinx populations, 47% of those households experiences energy insecurity. The numbers are bad also for lower income households and homes where there are small children in the home. When we turn to the clean energy transition, so I've painted a bleak picture of some of the bads. We know we are in the middle of an energy transition, and there are scholars who've been doing research in this space for a few years. A group of scholars from Berkeley looked at solar penetration rates, understanding that we're in this incredible moment of energy transition. And what they found is that the energy transition is leaving communities of color behind. Black and brown majority census tracts are not adopting solar at the same rates as majority white census tracts. And this is even when you control for household income and household ownership. So there's something structural that's happening even in this clean energy transition. We also know that resilience is a challenge in Black and brown households. There have been more and more studies showing that Black and brown households experience outages at higher rates. And I'm a Texan, so during last year's Storm Uri, I was following with very close attention what was happening in my home state. So I pulled this slide or this image from Twitter. There was a reporter from Austin American-Statesman that said, wow, look what we have. We have a tale of two cities. On the right is downtown Austin. This is where the university is. This is where majority white census tracts are. And on the left is East Austin. Look who has power. And so, of course, you might think, well, this is anecdotal. This is not real. This is not, a real representation of what has happened. And scholars wanted to know whether it was anecdotal. So they actually looked at the data, the outage data. And what they found was that areas with a higher share of minority population were more than 4 times as likely to suffer a blackout. So I could stop you there, and I'm sure there are many smart people in the room thinking, well, maybe it's because there was critical infrastructure on the right-hand side, on the west side, where there are majority white census tracts. And they said, no, the presence of hospitals or fire stations, critical facilities in a census block group, only reduced the chance of blackouts by 0 to 6%, which is a small percentage, does not otherwise explain the disparity among communities. Folks, the problem is structural. Further work is needed to understand those disparities. And here's an image from that same study that shows that areas with a higher share of a minority population were more likely to experience blackouts and prolonged outages. We've got a structural problem. I mentioned that Black and brown communities were more likely to be exposed to environmental hazards and harms. Black and brown communities are also more likely to be paying a higher amount of overall household income to meet energy needs. And when there is a major climate event, a weather event, those same communities do not experience the resilience of the energy system. We have a problem. We have a problem. And so what contributes to the intractability of the energy system? Well, we have a system within a system, right? We have a system of energy within multiple systems of oppression and inequality. I mentioned colonization. I mentioned structural racism. I mentioned development models at the outset. All of these things are contributing to the inequities that are baked into our energy system. So as we work to fix the energy system, we also have to work to fix these broader systems and structures of harm and oppression. Justice 40, as I wrap, I promise. Justice 40 and energy justice are really revolutionary and transformative tools that we have to advance social transformation, to begin to dismantle those broader systems that I talked about. Justice 40 is the president's promise that 40% of the benefits of our climate and clean energy spending will go to those frontline disadvantaged communities. In many ways, Justice 40 is rooted in energy justice, and energy justice again, is a definition or something that comes out of the scholarship. It comes out of activist practice, and this definition is one that we use at the Department of Energy. It refers to the goal of achieving equity in both the social and economic participation in the energy system, while also remediating social, economic, and health burdens on those who have historically been harmed by the energy system. These are frontline communities. Energy justice centers the concerns of those communities. The literature on energy justice has been evolving over the last 6 or 7 years, really growing out of work done by scholars in the UK and Northern Europe, focused on energy poverty, which is the cost of energy. But 3 tenets actually can be pulled out of the literature. Distributive or distributional justice, which is how the goods and bads of the system are distributed. Procedural justice, which is making sure communities have a seat at the table. And then recognition justice, which is recognizing that every single community comes to the table differently situated, and that we must design policy accordingly. I always like to point out the arrow at the bottom, which is restorative justice. And this is really the promise that we can heal each other, heal communities through energy policy, through the forward-looking space that energy policy creates. So how are we operationalizing it? And literally, this is going to be 30 seconds. How are we operationalizing this complex practice, this complex sort of theoretical frame of energy justice at the Department of Energy? I've said from day one, I'm not going to own it. It has to be all of us at the department. So it can't be the queer Black woman who's the one who owns justice at the agency. Everyone has to own it. And we really are making sure that there's collective ownership of energy justice. We're also totally transforming all of our policies, programs, our procurement approaches, and hiring to make sure that they're equitable. So really getting into the DNA of the organization. DEIA is so important. We have to build a team that understands communities, and we're building a team that looks like America as a result of that. We're also working on that dismantling of broader systems and structures. So we have to build the ecosystem of qualified workers, of diverse workers, and businesses that can avail themselves of DOE opportunities. The restorative justice piece and the recognition justice piece is coming into our day-to-day work. We're making place-based commitments. We're talking to communities every day, and not just at the beginning. We're talking to them in the middle and also at the end. But most of all, every day we recognize that we operate within a system of injustice. We operate within a system that was never designed to produce justice, and we acknowledge that. So we must actively work to dismantle our unjust system and also build new systems. So we are building a new system of carrots and sticks, which allows us to entice partners that are doing the right thing. We're iterating with communities on structural challenges, knowing that once dollars go out of the door at the department, they go into states and local governments that are not always aligned with us and our values. And then we are also taking a systems view of how energy transitions take place. And I look forward to the discussion of how we are actually doing that in more detail. But we have a lot of work to do as a global community on racial injustice, on structural inequality. But what I can say to you is that before the revolution occurs, this is the work I do every single day. And this is what I'm doing while I'm waiting for the broader world to change. So I appreciate your attention, and I went over a couple minutes.
Thank you so very much, Shalanda. That was wonderful. There was so much food for thought there, so much reflection, and so much pain as well. And thank you also for bringing the situation of Oaxaca, because we have, I think, a responsibility with the new school, certainly with EJ, to also look at the external, beyond the US, beyond the area, and also what is happening around the world. And also for bringing the idea of the system of nested complex systems within it. All right, let me now move on to introduce our next speaker. Rachel Morello-Frosch. She is a professor in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy and Management, and the School of Public Health at UC Berkeley. Her research has examined social determinants of environmental health among diverse communities with a focus on equality, psychosocial stress, and how these factors interact with environmental chemical exposures to produce health inequalities. Much of her work has examined environmental justice questions in the context of climate change, air pollution, exposures to environmental chemicals, and effects on fetal growth and developmental outcomes. often using community-based participatory research methods for data collection, something I really want to learn myself. In collaboration with communities and scientists, Dr. Morello-Frosch has also developed science policy tools for assessing the cumulative impacts of chemical and non-chemical stressors to improve regulatory decision-making and advance environmental justice. The question of trade-offs that I was trying to refer to before. In addition to her scientific articles, she's a co-author of Contested Illness, Citizens, Science and Health, Social Movements, amongst other fantastic pieces of literature. So please join me in welcoming Rachel Morello-Frosch.
Thanks, everybody, and it's been an amazing day, so I just want to give my thanks for inviting us to have these really exhilarating conversations, and I look forward to continuing them after our talks. So today, I want to talk about how we think about generating science that can advance environmental justice and policymaking. It's been a big topic of our discussions today. And so I'm going to talk about it through an environmental health lens, because I'm a public health person, I'm an epidemiologist, environmental health scientist. That's sort of my entry into this work as a scientist. But first, as I want to reiterate the ways in which social justice movements have an impact and reshape research priorities, the questions we ask, how we hypothesize disease causation, health and well-being in diverse communities. And in turn, those social justice movements have created change, particularly change in resources that are made available to engage communities in the scientific enterprise. And so the example that I have is Clinton's executive order on environmental justice really shifted thinking within the National Institutes of Health about how they were going to fund science. So that if you wanted to get a grant to create the center of this, that, and the other thing on some kind of health issue, you had to have a community engagement component. As part of that, a community partner. Decades later, where many of those academic community collaboratives have been going on for quite some time, it has really, and in my book, Contested Illnesses, it really has shifted how scientists hypothesize and study environmental links to disease. And I would say that those collaborations with communities and the engagement of communities into the regulatory process have lifted up ways to make our science better, have lifted up the fact that communities experience what we like to call a triple jeopardy of environmental riskscapes, okay? And so that requires us to do our science better and really take into account the social context in which people live, work, play, go to school, and interact with each other, the ways in which residential segregation, redlining, and yes, slavery and plunder and all kinds of other things that Shalanda was talking about still exert their influence today on our physical and social environments and impact our health. And that plays off differently by demographics, immigration status, income, wealth, geography, however we want to do it. And that can play out in exposure disparities, whether it's chemicals, climate change impacts, all kinds of things. And then we have the social vulnerability indicators, so everyday experiences with poverty, racism, and discrimination, which create exposures to chronic psychosocial stressors, which can have immune effects and make certain groups more vulnerable to the toxic effects of pollutants. And then finally, biological susceptibility, and I'm not talking about racial difference as a proxy for biological difference. I'm talking about the ways in which racism literally gets under the skin and can create vulnerabilities to the effects of hazards. And then also just pregnancy, life course, we're talking elderly or children that are inherently more biologically susceptible. So let me get to what I mean by making our science better in terms of environmental health. Many of us have started to really look at how do we understand legacies of racism and the ways in which it drives inequities. So I've been looking a lot at racial residential segregation in US cities and what it means for air quality. And much of our, this is a map here looking at the multi-group dissimilarity index of over 300 metropolitan areas of the United States. And it's basically a measure that says what proportion of people would have to move within a city from one census tract to another in order to achieve an even distribution of the different racial and ethnic groups that live there. So the places that are shaded in darker red are considered hyper-segregated, where over 60% of people would have to get up and move from one tract to another, just to give you a little context. And a lot of these patterns that we see today are due to different legacies of structural racism. One example is redlining, which people point to that being the policy of the 1930s, where the Homeowner Loan Corporation drew maps of communities and graded them, often based on the ethnic makeup of the neighborhoods that were there. But I would say that those maps are reflections of ongoing legacies of racism that had been happening before, and not only just by the federal government, but also by the lending industry, the real estate industry, and other things. So many of us have been applying these online redline maps that are now available to us to really look at what does that mean for the physical environment that we see today. This was a study that I had the privilege to collaborate on with colleagues in engineering at Berkeley, where we looked at historical redlining and its relationship to air pollution. And what you see here is that the darker grade neighborhoods, the grade D, which is the worst, in red, i.e. redlining, you can see that there's a dose-response relationship, whether we're talking about nitrogen dioxide pollution related to traffic-related air pollution or PM 2.5, which is the one on your right. And you can also see a racialized disparity even across grades, with Latinos, in this case Hispanics as defined by the US Census, and blacks often having the highest levels of air pollution, both for PM 2.5 and NO2. And this has pretty significant relevance for health. Because we know, for example, that PM 2.5 exposure is bad for perinatal outcomes and bad for pregnant people and their babies. So this is a study that we did a while ago where we looked at exposures to PM, different forms of PM10, PM 2.5 in the middle, and coarse PM, and what it means for the decrement in birth weight in offspring. And those different colors represent different racial and ethnic groups as self-identified in the birth certificate. And you can see in the red that the worst effects are for African American pregnant people in terms of overall decrements in birth weight. So these legacies of structural racism can have impacts on vulnerability to current day air pollution, both in terms of exposure, but also in terms of vulnerability of effect. So how do we move beyond documenting the problem in terms of environmental injustice to actually trying to flip the switch and look at how we evaluate the equity implications of certain policies and shifts in our energy sector? Another study that we have done is how do we leverage so-called natural experiments that happen to assess the short-term health benefits of things like power plant closures. So one study that we did looked at, we had 8 power plant closures over an 11-year period in California. And we wanted to see, could we see a short-term health signal, health benefit signal in the communities that were living near this power plant, okay? And this is a very common kind of natural experiment design called difference in differences design, where you're really trying to see, do you see something within a couple of years of the plant closure. In this case, we were looking at a very sensitive health outcome, rates of preterm birth. And the answer was that power plant closures were associated with a 2% reduction in preterm birth rates post-plant closures overall, particularly for preterm birth between 32 and 37 weeks. But the other notable thing I want to draw your attention to is that some of the effects were most dramatic for Asian pregnant folks and Black pregnant folks. And so that suggests that certain shifts in our energy sector and air pollution reductions can also have pretty significant positive equity implications, because we know that women of color are disproportionately impacted by high rates of preterm birth, particularly African American pregnant people. Another way that EJ science really needs to be headed is how do we forecast potential benefits of certain kinds of interventions, both for air pollution or climate change, but also health equity. So this is another example where we were able to take advantage of a very granular exposure assessment to nitrogen dioxide, black carbon, and ultrafine particles related to traffic using Google View streetcar mounting samplers. in West and downtown Oakland. And we wanted to see the extent to which a hypothetical intervention might reduce preeclampsia rates among pregnant women. And we leveraged electronic health record data from the Sutter Health System to look at these cases. And so this is looking at the effect of reducing these different pollutants, NO2, black carbon, and ultrafine particles, to the 25th percentile in a hypothetical intervention. And what you see is that the rates of preeclampsia, particularly for NO2 and black carbon, regardless of how you estimate your exposure, even within the 30-meter segment from someone's home or 120-meter segment, you do see a significant decrease. And again, the most dramatic effects that we see are for Black pregnant people in terms of the reductions, the forecasted reductions in preeclampsia rates. And this is another maternal health outcome that disproportionately affects African American pregnant people. So what are the implications for this science in terms of addressing cumulative impacts and advancing environmental justice? And this is where kind of the tension, I think, emerges, because we all want to do great science, and science takes a while, it's messy, and communities can't wait for us to sort it out. We always say at the end, more research needs to happen. That's pretty underwhelming for our community partners. So many of us have also worked to leverage our science and our data to support the development and the co-development of action-oriented science and tools that can really integrate place-level measures of environmental and social stressagens, that I like to call. How do we highlight communities of regulatory concern to target strategies that integrate public health, sustainability, and EJ goals, and target resources in the case, for example, of California's climate change investments, and as Shalanda was describing, Biden's Justice 40 initiative investments. So these are examples of tools that I and my lab have had privilege in helping to develop California-wide. We played a very big role in the development of California's CalEnviroScreen. We developed the first prototype that turned into CalEnviroScreen once legislation was passed to invest climate change investments. And then I've served on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and we spent a lot of time providing a lot of advice in the development of Biden's, CEQ's climate equity, climate and economic justice screening tool, which will help inform and direct investments under Justice 40. And then more locally, we can also think about how we co-develop tools. Those other tools that I just described to you were not necessarily co-developed with communities, but we've played roles in co-developing tools with environmental justice groups in California. One example is our Toxic Tides website, which is an attempt to predict sea level rise, surface flooding threats to hazardous facilities in low-lying areas in California. And we are expanding this analysis nationally, but you can check our website on California. And this was a huge collaborative between Climate Central as well as environmental justice groups in California and in Asian Pacific Environmental Network, CAUSE, and Physicians for Social Responsibility, and West Harlem Environmental Action, among others. And so we've obviously, we have a paper under review, as we're supposed to do as academics and scientists. So this is some of our results. This shows some of the hot spots in the worst case scenario of the number of facilities in the map where we expect flooding risks in 2100 in a worst case scenario. And then on the right, you can look at the counties that are where those facilities are located and the types of facilities that are threatened. Again, this is sort of the boring numbers thing in terms of the social vulnerability indicators that, and the characteristics of the block groups that are more likely to host an at-risk site of surface flooding that's at risk of surface flooding. So those neighborhoods tend to be ones that have low voter turnout, don't have access to a car, single-parent households, communities of color, and places with more renter-occupied units. But the tool was something that we co-developed with our EJ partners, where folks can really look and dig down into what these sites are, how you can find out about them, and what the estimated risks are for those different kinds of sites and what kinds of sites they are. And we can also, again, with our partners, people wanted to know, where are these sites? What do we know about the demographics of the site? How many people live there? Those kinds of things. So I think the important thing here, and I've had some really great conversations about how do we sort of leverage and scale up our work on EJ, how do we pose new questions, and I would encourage us to really think about anticipatory science, policy evaluation, and engaging communities in the co-development of tools that can advance environmental justice decision-making now as we continue to sort out and continue to produce great scientific work. Thank you so much.
That was fantastic, Rachel. I don't know how you managed to put so much into one single talk of about 15 minutes. That's terrific. I love many things, including the wonderful thing that you shared about natural experiments, that kind of hypothesis and contrasting different treatments to assess things. Fantastic. Now to our third speaker. Mm-hmm. There you go. Thank you so much. Dr. Beth Rose Middleton Manning is a professor of Native American Studies at UC Davis. She received her BA in Nature and Culture from UC Davis and her PhD in Environmental Science, Policy, and Management from UC Berkeley, same place as Rachel. Her research centers on native environmental policy and native activism for site protection using conservation tools. Her broader research interests include intergenerational trauma and healing, native land stewardship, and rural environmental justice, amongst many other topics. Her book, In the Land, New Directions for Tribal Conservation, emphasizes native applications of conservation easements with an emphasis on conservation partnerships led by California Native nations. Beth Rose has published on native economic development, political ecology, history of environmental justice movements, market-based conservation tools, and challenges to cultural protection, amongst many other really fantastic topics. She has collaborative projects which include creating curriculum on land transfers to Northern California Native nations, tribal leaderships and land removals, and cultural burning for ecosystems health. All of those things are, if you know a little bit about the Jasper's Biological Preserve and what we have here, all of those are fantastic things that we should benefit from learning a lot. And so we're very much delighted to have you with us, Beth Rose, and please join me in welcoming her. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. What a pleasure it is to be here with each of you, and so honored and grateful for our gracious hosts here today. So I am a social scientist. I'm in Native American Studies, and I'll be sharing a little today on concerns around rural and indigenous environmental justice. I appreciate the sharing of the land acknowledgement. I want to recognize and pay tribute and gratitude to where we are on Muwekma lands. So we've talked about environmental justice. I'd like to hone in very specifically on rural EJ. So impacts and scope of pollution in less populated areas where people are often hidden in data around what's happening in terms of human health and contamination. And there are understudied pathways for how health is impacted by pollution and contamination. Also, indigenous environmental justice takes a much longer view, attentive to the impacts of seizing tribal homelands, establishing settler colonial institutions, which might be energy institutions as well as other sorts of institutions, processes and practices that result in ongoing injustices and exclusion, and culturally specific impacts of contamination. So to sum it up, unequal exposures, culturally specific exposures, and impacts on subsistence, where you get your local food, water, medicine, etc. Rural and indigenous EJ issues are often hidden. They're kind of invisible on some of these maps. There's abandoned industrial sites, there's rampant illegal dumping, non-point source pollution, some of which is legacy pollution, and understudied exposure pathways. There's jurisdictional gaps. So how do we bring these issues to light? So I'll talk about a couple areas in which I work, and I look forward to thinking together on other ways to do this work. So I spent a number of years, and this is in my second book, Upstream, trust lands and power on the Feather River, and I'm currently working on this on other dam projects, looking at the development of water infrastructure, hydropower in particular, and the ways in which people were removed and that was never acknowledged and there was never any repair or restitution of any kind associated with that. So this is an image from northeastern California, headwaters of the State Water Project, as well as much of the hydropower infrastructure that has fed the Bay Area for a century. And these are lands that were set aside for tribal members. So not only lands that were just seized, but lands that had been set aside, and then you can see the redlining is cancellation of those lands patented to the power company. So those lands were seized. There was no recognition of that. I began working with the Maidu Culture and Development Group and was able to learn about these issues. The build out of that infrastructure also stopped the migration of salmon. Those are salmon hitting the barriers at the Oroville Dam, which is downstream of this upstream area, and impacted and continues to impact people culturally, health-wise, in terms of healthy diet and local foods until today. The other two images to the right show local activism, which some of this research was able to support, and people were able to get some of these lands returned through the Stewardship Council process. So there was a direct outcome from some of this work. Rural and Indigenous environmental justice also calls us to identify where the contamination is and how it's affecting rural populations. So we have a couple of collaborations with the Yurok Tribe Environmental Program. Many of the sources of contamination there are from legacy timber infrastructure, they're from illegal marijuana grows, they're from agricultural inputs upstream. People are directly exposed because they're eating from the local environment, they're doing ceremony there, they're in the water, they're drinking from springs, and they're out on the landscape, and we're out there when spraying was happening in previous decades. So there are legacy impacts here. I've been working in a really nice interdisciplinary collaboration with environmental engineering, public health, to do sampling of water, tributaries, and the Klamath, and sediment to figure out what is there, and then working with people in the community to identify the pathways of exposure and see how they might be impacted. We can't all necessarily say that this pollution comes from the timber infrastructure or the illegal grow, but we can share the information about what's there and then work with the tribe, takes the lead on how to address those issues. We also had a goal of developing detection techniques, so bringing up citizen science, whereby people could look locally and see what type of contaminant is there through like a dip-stip sort of technology. We're also working with the tribe on a project they requested involving passive environmental sampling devices, these silicone wristbands that absorb what they are exposed to on a daily basis. So that is in process right now. I also work on creative opportunities for applying conservation tools. So if we think about conservation, sometimes that's not thought of as an environmental justice issue, but it very much is in terms of exclusion and enclosure of tribal homelands so that people are not able to be there to harvest foods, to do ceremony, to carry out traditional responsibilities to those lands. So there's a colonial history of seizing lands and criminalization of indigenous land stewardship. So I'm really happy to work with a number of native land trusts, including Sogorea-Te Land Trust, which is just here across the bay, that have been really doing creative and powerful work to bring land back into indigenous stewardship. Looking at policy approaches, I wanted to bring up the beneficial use categories, which are the foundation for water quality objectives on waterways throughout California. These are standard beneficial uses, designated uses of water bodies in California. In 2017, 3 new beneficial uses were recognized. Cultural beneficial use, T-sub is tribal subsistence, and sub is subsistence. So often the last category refers to low-income populations, often immigrant minority populations who are eating from local waterways. And that may or may not be recognized in the designated beneficial use for that waterway. So therefore, the water quality standards don't protect that beneficial use. It's difficult to get these BUs applied, even though they have been recognized. Water bodies have to be designated in a public process, and evidence has to be generated that people are, in fact, fishing from that waterway or doing ceremony at that waterway, and then the objectives can protect those uses. But it can be difficult if you're potentially a marginalized population to share that information and thereby get the water quality protections. This is a work in progress. This is some work to generate some tools that tribes may be able to use to advocate for applying the beneficial uses. These are some mapping tools. Finally, working on stewardship interventions. So related to conservation, the seizure of native lands means that plant and animal species are not available for indigenous stewardship. They're subject to catastrophic fire because they're not being tended. And so we're involved in several initiatives to reintroduce cultural stewardship. So it may be traditional burning, it may be indigenous methods of plant propagation, and these are very beneficial for landscape health as well as community health. But they are challenged by land access. These are some images from our cultural burn workshops and working with weavers who are able to harvest the healthy material after it's been tended by traditional stewardship. So to sum up, some of the key issues I've raised here are legacy and non-point source pollution in rural areas, under-recognized and persistent exclusion of people who live in rural areas, specific exposure pathways, criminalization of traditional subsistence and traditional land stewardship, and illegal dumping. So I've raised some issues and also some pathways for addressing them, but I'm grateful to be able to bring up the rural and indigenous aspects of environmental justice. Thank you.
That was awesome.
Thank you.
And now I would like to invite the three of you to please come to the front of the auditorium and open it up for engagement with the public. And Vanessa, I want to see you when you tell me how the time is going, please. Okay, so there were a number of questions that were submitted previously, and some questions were also asked during the meetings that they had with some of you. But I wanted to kick us off with one question that I think is going to be present in the minds of many students. The question is, and I think it's going to be a big question, but hopefully you can summarize your incredibly long and fantastic career paths. What intellectually or spiritually inspired you to pursue these amazing career paths? Because we have three fantastic perspectives, and we'd love to see how you got there. Please, go ahead.
I can start it off. First of all, amazing presentations. It's so great to be on this panel and to be in dialogue. And again, thanks everyone for your attention. I mean, I'm sort of an accidental energy justice person. I was a lawyer working in project finance, and during the financial crisis, the world was falling apart, and I thought, how do I contribute to making this world a better place? And so I sort of cut ties with corporate law and moved to Mexico. And as a project finance lawyer, I understood the architecture of building energy projects. I understood the finance. I understood how deals were made. And so when I saw indigenous people in Oaxaca fighting against large energy projects that were financed using the same models of development that I had facilitated, I got really interested in that. I got really curious about it. And I was telling a group of students earlier today that, when I came into that work back in 2010, we were still very siloed as academics. And so it's like, oh, well, are you an environmental, scholar? Are you a indigenous rights scholar? Are you an energy, a finance scholar? Like, what are you? What are you doing? And I was like, I'm actually trying to bring all these things together because the complexity of our world is not a single discipline, right? It requires different analytical frames and tools to blend. And it took a while for us to get there in terms of really recognizing the interdisciplinarity and the transdisciplinarity of climate and the problems that we have to confront. But it was something that I wanted to just keep doing and keep tackling, and I've had a lot of help along the way, from community members, from mentors who said, keep asking the questions, keep doing the work. And now a president who said, I want to make justice and equity a center point of my administration. And so my work in many ways met its moment, but there was never a guarantee that I would be here doing this work. I just knew really spiritually, and I think at my core, that it was work that needed to be done, particularly as we embark on reimagining our entire energy system.
Fantastic, thank you. Rachel, Ms. Rose?
Yeah, wow, that's a big question. My family is, half of my family is from Argentina, so I grew up in a household that had to deal with a dictatorship, and there was a lot of effort to help people get out of the country, get out of jail, and so the sort of engaging in social justice and really deep struggle had always sort of been kind of in my house, in my life. And then in college, I was very involved in social justice organizing, particularly around Latino health education and educational opportunity organizing. I was in Mecha and other groups, and then when I left college, I thought I wanted to become a civil rights attorney. I worked for an organization. I got a job I was very unqualified for, but that was totally awesome, in Equal Rights Advocates, which is a civil rights organization that was fighting to desegregate the Forest Service, the fire service in San Francisco, and I was helped collaborate on their Women of Color project at the time. And that was when, like, the intersectionality, if you will, around civil rights, immigrant rights, public health and environmental health sort of like became very apparent to me. And I kind of realized, like, I could get into a litigation maybe for about 10 years, and then I'd probably burn out on it, because you win a case and then you spend the next 20 years enforcing the consent decree, which is what I was watching my lawyer colleagues do. So, and I was very excited about science, so I thought I wanted to go to med school. And in the process of kind of getting ready for that, I returned to Berkeley and got an MPH, and ended up falling in love with public health and in epidemiology, because it seemed like it really combined my passions about science and integrating of social justice. The field of social epidemiology was emerging, looking at structural and social determinants of health. And as an environmental health scientist, I really found that huge opportunity to merge those passions. And also in public health, it's very engaged. You're also trying to do research that will lead to change and improve the health of communities. So that's kind of what gets my passion.
Fantastic, thank you.
Wonderful. So I grew up in rural Northern California, mill over the hill, mine pit in the backyard. So I was, and also reservoirs and dams nearby. So I had a curiosity about infrastructure. I also, I'm Black and white, Afro-Caribbean and Eastern European, so definitely a minority, not clear pathways to participate in decision-making or to raise concerns about issues you saw around you. When I went to college, I was at UC Davis. I tried to study the relationships between people and their environment and patterns of decision making. After I graduated, I was developing a project to bring together very different and divergent attitudes about forest management. So at that time, there was a lot of tension between advocating for intensive logging, keeping those mills running, and the spotted owl protecting the forest, and it was very polarized. So I did a lot of interviews in Northern California with people all across that spectrum, and found that there was a lot more overlap, actually, than there was difference, that people wanted jobs, that they wanted healthy places to live, that they wanted local economies. Also, while I was doing that work, I started working with a Native nonprofit, and they were doing some of the work I spoke about in the presentation, mapping their lands that had been flooded by hydropower. And it was really eye-opening to me, because I thought, why have we never learned, much like many of my students now, why have we never learned about this before? This injustice is right in front of us, and nobody's doing anything about it. And people still don't have secure housing. There's no recognition that that's their homeland. So I began working on that as well. And it kind of all came together in terms of justice, lack of representation, and opportunities for land stewardship that were under-recognized but still have a lot of potential. So that's kind of what drives me. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you so much. I'm happy to open it up for questions from the audience, if anybody has a question. There you go, please. There's a mic coming up to you because we're recording.
Oh, you're gonna hold it? Yeah. Oh, okay. Sorry, I'm not used to this. Thank you all for a great presentation. Khalid Osman, I'm in civil and environmental engineering as an assistant professor. A common theme I sort of captured from all of your presentations is a lot of environmental justice is undoing a lot of environmental injustice. And so I just wanted to ask you as a crowd, what does environmental justice look like in terms of being proactive before something becomes an injustice?
Thank you.
So I can speak quickly. Thank you. Great question. So I want to take the moment to distinguish among the different types of justice discourse. And I love that you introduced sort of rural and indigenous EJ in your talk. I think there are many ways to kind of think about justice in this moment. So environmental justice was very much a discourse that grew out of the 1980s as a result of really massive changes to our legal system, right? We had this massive set of environmental legislation that got passed in a bipartisan manner in the 1970s, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. And communities of color looked at this legislation and they said, well, our lived experiences are not changing. And so activists actually said, we think this is environmental racism. We're not convinced that these laws are actually going to impact our lives. And so out of the 1980s and into the 90s, culminating with President Clinton's order on EJ 12898 in 1992, activists and scholars partnered on understanding what was happening in communities. And so the climate justice movement really builds on that work, understanding that climate will have disproportionate impacts on those same communities, and that we must design climate policies and responses accordingly. So it's not as much about the cleanup and undoing, but it's recognizing that these pre-existing issues exacerbate harm in the climate moment. So I want to introduce energy justice, which is the field of scholarship in which I situate myself, which is very much, I say, and this is a little bit contested, but for me, it's a forward-looking terrain. Like we're looking at designing the energy system in a way that does not create environmental harm. So I don't want to reproduce the injustice that we know exists because of the environmental justice scholarship and activist practices. I also want to make sure that we're creating a new energy system that is responsive to climate risks and issues that are being faced in many of those same communities, but also, so I sort of blazed through a bunch of the literature that is in existence on energy justice. We want to make sure we have equitable distribution of all of this new clean energy technology. We know that because of structural inequalities and the way our system is designed, that hasn't been the case. So we're working to make sure that there's equitable distribution, there's actual access to capital in those same communities that have faced disinvestment for years. Again, we're so focused on the siting issues with respect to clean energy deployment. We also know that we want every part of our economy to win. There's going to be a lot of wealth created here. So black and brown businesses, new workers in this new economy, I mean, resilience. We need to ask those types of research questions that sort of fill out the canon of energy justice, which again, just builds on that thread created, I would argue, in the 1980s and 90s with the environmental justice scholars and also the activists that were clamoring for recognition of the ways in which their communities were different. So to me, there's a link, but it's very different. And in my work, I'm working hard to make sure I'm not creating environmental injustice through the clean energy transition.
Any of you?
I think that we need to consider what were the assumptions, what was the thinking that built the infrastructure that we have and the processes that we have that have caused all of these inequalities and exacerbated injustices, because we're in a moment where things are different. I mean, the climate is changing. It's hotter, it's drier. How do we move in this new moment not with the same assumptions that we designed the infrastructure of the past. So in my case, not with the assumption that upstream lands, wherever you are, it doesn't have to be in California, that the upstream lands are a colony, basically, for extraction, that certain populations don't matter or not as represented. How do we change that thinking fundamentally? I think that's the question. What do we put into our models that takes into account that values, rural livelihood, sustainable livelihood, healthy ecology?
Rachel, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, just quickly. I mean, I think the key is building on what already has been well said, that going forward, that the issue of equity and sustainability, they have to be integrated. It can't just be like EJ can't just be this thing over here, this little interest thing. That when we move forward in terms of developing policies or whether we're developing air quality standards, that those two things have to be really interrelated. And by doing so, you're going to be improving environmental quality for everybody and also addressing the equity gaps at the same time. We know, for example, that more segregated cities have worse air pollution overall for everybody, even though within those cities there are huge racial gaps. So that suggests that the inequity degrades environmental quality for everybody. And you can imagine how that plays out in segregated cities where people have to drive further to access jobs and services and those kinds of things. So I think where you just really making sure when you're thinking about policy not to keep repeating the same mistakes, you're centering equity as part of that sustainability strategy.
Thank you. Thank you for that question, Khalid. There's a question over there, please.
And one in the back, too.
And one at the back.
Okay, thank you. I'm Dele Ogunseto. I'm a visiting professor at the Center for Innovation in Global Health. Wonderful presentations, not surprisingly. Earlier today, there was a judgment by a U.S. judge to support the lithium mining activity in Nevada to proceed, despite some protests and challenges. And this brings me to the question that we just addressed around fracturing communities, because the definition of justice and protection of vulnerable people may not be equally bought into by the community members. Labor, work, housing, all of those things also mean something to those who are in that community. So how do you research or build into the tools these differences of valuation of labor, health, and schools, and the things that families differ in their interpretation?
I think it's to you, Shalanda.
I thought so, Rodolfo. But I'm sure other people, I know this is a really straightforward question. I mean, this is one of the essential questions, right? How do you, I mean, this is a trade-off question, I think, that teed up a lot of the conversation. When I entered the work of energy justice, it was unpopular because environmentalists thought thinking about equity and justice now will slow us down on climate. And now we're really trying to address head-on these challenges, and we finally see, I think, the ways in which sort of upstream issues in terms of supply chain are going to have deleterious consequences on communities. So there are scholars who are starting to look at that, mainly looking at issues in the global south, but with an imperative to do a lot of our new supply work here in the US, we are going to be confronting it head on. And so I don't want to get into the sort of valuation question, which is more of an economics debate that I would prefer not to delve into. But I will say that no community is a monolith, and we can produce better outcomes with community engagement and participation. I mean, that is that procedural justice piece. I think because of the scale and scope of development we know is coming in the next 5 to 10 years, we are going to have to radically rethink the way we're doing development. And so I think that's going to mean new business models, new approaches, obviously new ways of engagement, which will produce different outcomes. But I also think we will need new business models as well. So there isn't an easy solution here. My last slide was, this is the work I'm doing while I'm waiting for the world to sort of transform itself. And the work I'm doing is really to do better than we've done in the past, right? Disrupt the assumptions about community value and what people are worth. Introduce those questions in our processes at the Department of Energy. But there will be tension, every step of the way. And so stay tuned. I mean, I think, again, these are things I go to bed with every night and things that keep me up. How do we do this massive transition with all the gigawatts that need to go into the ground, and all of the things that it will take to build those things? And our history does not look good in the places where that type of development has happened. So again, we're running as fast as we can to change the architecture of development so that we produce different outcomes. But really great question, and it is one of the hardest questions that we confront.
Thank you. I think there was a question somewhere in the back. Yeah.
Elliot, I think.
Elliot White Jr., Assistant Professor in Earth System Science. I think all of you mentioned activism at least once in your presentations. So can you talk about the relationship between scholarship and activism in the way that you see it? Thank you.
Great question, Elliot.
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question in terms of how do you do community-engaged research as a scientist, and collaborate with people who are activists in ways that are authentic and support the needs of and aspirations of everybody. The way that I have approached it is very often communities or community organizations approach me in part because they've had a desire to marshal scientific resources to fill knowledge gaps that can inform either their advocacy in the policy arena or their community organizing and advocacy work. They feel like they need scientific information to really decide how they want to approach things. I think when you're in, there's a continuum of environmental justice collaboration with communities, and the idea is to go, my desire has always been to go from just simple translational research to transformational research that actually has policy change, and that's a continuum in terms of engagement. And I think the key is to really, before you undertake work together, to have really candid discussions about what expectations and needs are, and also what the risks are about doing this kind of work together. What kind of resources it's going to take. Data work in mysterious ways. What happens if the analysis that you choose to undertake together maybe does not validate community wisdom on what people think is going on? And that can happen. So how do you forecast that and how to address that? And sometimes the decision is, well, do you really need more science, or is there enough science out there already? The goal is to try and synthesize really good science and package it in a way that communities can use and take off with, because sometimes we don't need more research. There's plenty of research there. Sometimes it doesn't require more data collection. There's really good data out there that can be marshaled and used. We're just awash in big data right now that we can leverage without having to tax community organizations to collaborate in additional data collection. And I think the important thing, as a public health person, I feel like collaboration with communities, I obviously have to publish in peer-reviewed publications, and that's my quote-unquote currency as an academic and a scientist. But I also feel like when I collaborate with communities, it really enhances the relevance and reach of my science in ways that I would never be able to do by myself. Because community collaborators put faces on your boring statistics in ways that are really compelling to decision makers, much more so than if I just go up there and talk about, show the geeky graphs that I just showed you today. So I think those types of collaborations can actually take your science to a new level in terms of its impact that people, I think, underappreciate. But the key is to really have those conversations at the beginning of the partnership about what the needs, expectations, and risks of doing that are for everyone involved.
Fantastic. There's a bunch of questions, but okay. Ali, you have the next person.
Hi, my name is Alexis Wilson. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Earth System Science here. I do soil biogeochemistry, environmental justice, and community engaged research. And one of the issues I'm running into is that the speed at which science runs, which is very slow, doesn't match the speed at which communities really need results so that they could make the best management decisions for the issues that we're working on. So I wondered what advice you have on kind of balancing wanting to give them results that they can really act on, but also wanting to make sure you protect the integrity and like quality of the data that you're giving them, because I'm really struggling with that. Thank you.
Yeah. I feel your pain. Where the reality of different timelines and urgency on that. Again, it's really important to set expectations about the time it takes to do really good work. And so for me, like we've had those same timeline tensions around biomonitoring studies, for example, where we collect biospecimens from people and we're sending them to a lab and we're doing all this analytical. It takes a while. And people want to know, like, what'd you find, you know, right away. So often what we do is to figure out, again, oftentimes the things that we're studying, there is information out there already and good science already. So if your data is not ready for prime time, that's fine. But how do you create deliverables and things that communities can use now to inform their work now as they wait for the data to roll in? So an example we have is a collaboration that we have with women firefighters in San Francisco. And they work very hard to desegregate the fire department for people of color as well as women. They were very worried about elevated breast cancer rates in their ranks. We did a big exposure study in biomonitoring. It took a very long time to do the lab work. But in the interim, we were able to develop some products on chemicals that we already knew were associated with firefighting. So things related to PFAS exposure in foams and turnout gear. We were able to help them develop outreach materials to try and shift the culture among the firefighting community about how to better protect yourself in the job. And then we also helped them with information. And then our data, when our data were ready and we released it, it helped leverage efforts in the policy arena to phase out PFAS out of firefighting foams in California. So it just, you have to kind of figure out those interim steps where you can provide things while you're waiting for your data to get ready for prime time. It's hard though.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I do know that there's a lot of hands that were raised, and I'm very sorry that we don't have time, but I promise you there's going to be a reception now. I don't promise there's going to be caviar and margaritas for everybody, but we will have an opportunity to continue chatting with the fantastic speakers today. I came today with the expectation that I would be more informed, inspired, and involved in these issues of environmental justice, and I can say that I'm very happy with the amount of new information, the amount of perspectives that I've gotten, the inspiration that I've gotten today, and my motivation to be even more involved. And thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for these terrific presentations, for the time that you spent with talking to the rest of the community today and yesterday. And what I would like to do now is to ask our Dean, Arun, to please come and say some few words to wrap up the event, and then we'll meet downstairs in the reception. Arun, please.
Well, I stand between you and your reception, so I'll be brief. First of all, this reminded me, just listening to the various presentations and the dialogue, reminded me of listening to the symphony of my favorite composer, Beethoven. And because those of you who follow that music, I mean, there's this violin, this cello, there is an oboe. And if you listen to them individually, you know, it's good. But if you bring them together, it is unbelievable heavenly music. And that's what we listen to today. And to get any symphony out, you need a conductor. So, Rodolfo, thank you for being Thank you for being the conductor and bringing that music all together. The purpose of the Dean's Lecture Series is to create a discourse and a dialogue and really opportunities to learn about those issues that don't neatly fit into departments, but transcend and span the whole school. So the goal is to identify those topics where knowledge, scholarship, and solutions are critically important for our vision of humanity and our planet thriving together. We decided to lead the Dean's Lecture Series with the topic of environmental justice. And what you did today, Shalanda, Beth Rose, and Rachel, is unbelievable because we learned. We learned about Justice 40. We learned about indigenous EJ, and we learned about anticipatory science and developed tools and co-developed tools for action-oriented solutions. And that is exactly what this purpose was. I've always talked about climate change as a gigaton scale problem, requiring gigaton scale solutions. It is also a giga-people problem. There are 8 billion human beings on Earth, and by the end of the century, there are likely to be 11 billion people. So while we solve the gigaton scale problem, we cannot leave anyone behind. Environmental justice is a local issue, as we have heard. It is a national issue, as we also heard. It is also a global issue. It is also a giga-species problem. We cannot leave any species behind. And so when we look at, as we embark on this journey to transition our economy, and all the things that we do that gives us the quality of life, we have to address these giga problems simultaneously. That is the real challenge of sustainability. And so we have, of course, scholarship going on out here, but we need to do more, which is why we are launching a school-level faculty search on environmental justice, focused on environmental justice. And we hope to bring together other talents into our school. I just want to thank you again to all the speakers who attend and for all of you attending. Let me end with the indigenous quote that is painted on my office walls. We do not inherit this earth from our ancestors, but we borrow it from our children. It changes the reference of what we do and how we look at the future. And when we talk about our children, let's make sure we talk about all the children in the world as we move along. With that, let's not waste any more time. Let's go for the reception. But thank you again for all your wisdom.